Okay, just let me share the screen. Okay, it's working. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So first, okay, just few words to introduce myself. I'm Tommaso Chiti from the University of Tuscia, which is a partner of the IPROMO summer school. I'm a soil scientist and I'm dealing mainly with the impact of climate change on natural ecosystem, particularly on forest, but also on agriculture. Oops, sorry. Okay. And okay, now it's better. And I've been working in several places all over the world, basically in Africa and Southeast Asia and in Europe. Today, I will talk you, since the presentation has been reduced, about natural afforestation in mountain areas. Natural afforestation is similar to afforestation. Afforestation is an human-induced process, and Lucia in the presentation before already told you that it is used worldwide as a practice to mitigate climate change. Natural afforestation is exactly the same, but is not human-induced. It's a natural process, but however, it's a process that is occurring worldwide. However, from South America, in Europe, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And we will see today a specific case study at the Italian level, but also another case study, for instance, in Africa, just to let you understand how large can be the differences, but however, is a process that is leading to mitigation. Okay, we already saw the importance of forests globally because forests are basically covering something like 30% of the global surface. So they are very important in terms of climate change because they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, mitigating the negative effect of climate change. But forests are not only providing benefits in terms of climate change. If you look at if we are talking in terms of ecosystem services, forests provide many ecosystem services. For instance, they contain 90% of the global biodiversity. They are able to impact the water regime, protecting the soil against erosion. In the developing country, more than 1 billion people depend directly from the product of the forest for eating. And imagine that 2 billion people are using wood for eating that cover mostly about 70% of the daily energetic needs, basically in Africa and in Southeast Asia. But when we are talking about forests, we always focus on the above ground biomass. That is something that we can easily see because we see the biomass of the trees, and we can, it contains a lot of carbon because the biomass is large. But what we cannot see, the soil, it contains much more carbon than the biomass. If you look at this graph, which is reporting the amount of carbon stored in the above ground vegetation, the green bars, and in the below ground soil compartment down to 100 centimeters of depth, we realize that in all the ecosystem, the soil carbon pool is much bigger than the above ground carbon pool. Only in tropical forests there is a balance where 50% of the carbon is stored in the vegetation and more or less 50% of the carbon is stored in the soil. So if you are talking today, we will focus, of course, on climate change and the importance of forests and of the process of natural afforestation to be used as a mitigation practice. As I told you, it is not a practice because it's something involuntary, and we will see later on. But however, when we are talking about forests and climate change, atmospheric carbon, the CO2 present in the atmosphere, is the primary source of carbon because the plants, through the photosynthesis, are able to transform the inorganic carbon as the CO2 in organic forms to the photosynthetic process to build branches, trunks, leaves. Then this material arrives to the soil through the litter deposition and starts the decomposition process, where part of this carbon is going back to the atmosphere as a CO2, but a great share of this carbon is entering the soil system, where it can stay for centuries and millennia, much more than the carbon in the above ground biomass, which is related to the leaf of the trees. Some centuries in the best cases. Here you can have an idea of the amount of litter of the carbon inputs that are arriving annually to the soils in different ecosystems from the above ground biomass litter deposition. On average, you can see here are reported different type of ecosystem from Arctic to temperate, but on average, the amount of litter arriving to the soil is around 5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. But what we cannot see, again, what is below ground, the root production, is in most of the cases similar to the production of the above ground biomass, on average 5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And you have to think that roots, 70% of the roots are fine roots, and these fine roots have a limited, they live basically between 1 and 3 years. So their turnover is very, very fast. And as soon as they die, they are already incorporated into the soil. So they pass directly from the below ground carbon pool, so the root pool, to the soil organic carbon pool. It's not like the litter that need to decompose to get inside the soil, but they are already inside the soil. So the inputs from the vegetation to the soil organic carbon pool are very huge annually. Let's start now, after this brief introduction on forests and the importance of forests for climate change, on focusing on Italy, because I'm going to introduce you this case study at the national level related to the wood encroachment, so natural afforestation. Italy, if you look on this map about the IPCC climate zone, you can realize that the climate from north to south is very different. We have a polar moist type of climate on the Alps, while going towards south, the climate become temperate, warm, temperate, and dry, and warm, temperate, moist. And as you can realize, particularly in the southern part of Italy, in Sicily, or however in the other region, in the southern part, climate is very similar to the one that you have in the northern part of Africa. If you look at the soil type, okay, the IPCC soil map is very simplified, and it seems that in Italy we have only one soil type. But if you look at this map from the FAO, the World Reference Base for Soil Classification, you realize that there are instead different soil types in Italy, even if the main soil type, the majority of the different soils are included in the order of the Cambisols, which is an order represented by young soils, where the pedogenesis is still, I would say, at the beginning. So they are still under formation. Introducing a little bit the vegetation that we have in Italy, we have, of course, both conifer and broadleaf vegetation. The main types of conifer species are included in for instance, spruce, larch, different type of pines, and they occur mainly on the Alps, but also along the seaside. Think that there are many Mediterranean type of pines that are growing along the coast, while in the central and the southern part of Italy, the predominant type of vegetation is related to broadleaf species, basically oaks. There are several types of oaks that are typical of the Mediterranean area, and which occurrence is very typical also in Italy. The prevalence is in fact of the oak species, different type of oaks, and if the main species instead comprising the conifer type of trees are related to the spruce. We have fir spruce and silver spruce, basically. Silver fir on the Alps, on the Apennine, and red spruce on the Alps, basically. Let's have a look briefly to the forest cover of Italy. First, let's see this nice map from 1936, where you can see that how it was the vegetation of Italy in terms of conifer, broadleaf, and mixed forest along the Italian peninsula at that time. If we look at a map of a few years ago, we can realize that the vegetation in Italy, the forest vegetation, is increasing. You can realize it basically because all those parts in the map of 1936 are in the 2012 are much greener. And if you pay attention to where these forests are located, this is a map of Italy that shows you the location of the mountains. Here from south to north we have the Apennine Chain from Sicily up to the Liguria region, more than 1,000 kilometers. And here we have the Alpine Chain from west to east. And how you can realize all the forests are basically located on the Apennine and Alpine chain. So what's going on while forests are increasing at national level? Because of secondary cessation. Secondary cessation is a process that is taking care in Italy, but is taking place all over the world, in South America, in Africa, in Russia, in North America. And it is a process related to the fact that urbanization is increasing and people are moving from the most remote area toward the city center. So they are abandoning this remote area. They are abandoning also all the activities that were going on in that place in terms of agriculture and breeding. So this abandonment causes a land use change, a natural land use change, because if you have a grassland or a cropland and you don't cultivate it anymore or you don't use it anymore for grazing, the woody vegetation start to enter in these areas. First, of course, you have pioneer species in terms of basically shrubs that start to colonize the entire area. But then arrive three pioneer species, and slowly, with time, you will have the climate vegetation of that specific area that, of course, it can be different from the place where the process is taking place. You can have a final forest of broadleaf or a final forest of conifers. And we will see later that these impact differently the mitigation potential provided by the forests. So in Italy, this process is a process, the process of woody encroachment is a process that started basically after the Second World War, and it's related to the abandonment. Cities started to grow, so the most remote areas that were also those that had the harsh condition for living and for the production started to be abandonment, leading the start to the process of the secondary cessation. And in fact, if you look at the amount of territories abandoned after the Second World War, realize that this represents almost 8% in the entire Europe from the period 1950 till 2010, while for Italy they represent about 1%, considering the period 1990-2000. So it's a lot of land that is affected by this process. But which are the main changes that this process is leading to the soil? basically, because of course, if we are talking about vegetation, we have a switch from herbaceous to perennial vegetation represented by the trees. But what's happening on the soil? You have a minimum impact on the main soil properties. Texture is not changing because it's not affected by the vegetation, but the switch from grassland, mountain grassland, to forest is usually leading to a possible increase in soil erosion. You have a reduction in the soil moisture because rain doesn't impact directly the soil, but impact the canopy of the forest. So you have less water reaching the soil. All these changes are basically related usually to the desertification process. While in terms of, for instance, in terms of compaction, you don't have any compaction from the switch from grassland to forest, because as I told you, this process is a natural process, it's not human induced, so there is not any use of machinery, and the soil is not prepared, as in the case of the afforestation, where you prepare the soil and you plant the trees. Here you don't do anything of this operation, but everything is occurring naturally with time. In terms of chemical properties, you have instead some important changes. First of all, the pH of the soil is changing because you are going from herbaceous vegetation, which is made basically by cellulose, and you go toward a forest vegetation that, depending if you have a conifer or broadleaf vegetation, is however much richer in lignin. Lignin, which is a compound not so easily decomposable by the microbes. So particularly for conifer, you have an accumulation of litter in the organic layer, while for the conifers, well, for the broadleaf, you have the litter is entirely decomposed within the year of production. So what you have, it is usually an increase in the carbon and nitrogen content in those pools. In terms of nutrients, again, there is no any sensible, significant increase or decrease. Nutrients more or less remain the same during the entire process. In terms of biological properties, of course, if you compare grasslands with forests, you have a higher biodiversity in grasslands. So from grassland to forest, you have a decrease in biodiversity, but it is not a plantation. So being a natural process compared to the afforestation, natural afforestation is however leading to a higher biodiversity. However, if you look at the forest, again, grassland, you have basically an impact on the fungal communities, which are much higher in the forest ecosystem. And so it affects also the activity of the soil microbial community, which is favored compared to the bacterial ones, which are much greater in the grasslands. The plant species composition is changing, and this is the main factor which affected the biological properties of the soil. Conifers release a less potable organic material, which is not so good for the microbes, which find it difficult to degrade because it is made basically by lignin. And in fact, you have an accumulation of the organic layer. So the background of the study, which I'm going to present you, are basically that if you look at the process of natural afforestation, we have an obvious increase of the carbon in the above ground biomass and in the necromass present in an ecosystem. You pass from an herbaceous to a forest, and so before there was no any trees, and then you have only trees. So carbon is increasing. The potential of mitigation is very huge. But what's happening to the soil organic carbon pool, which is the largest pool during the process of natural afforestation? The situation is not really clear because usually the layer which is investigated during this natural land use change is only the top 0.30 centimeter of soil, which is the minimum soil compartment that is considered for within the international agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol, or within the National Inventory Report of Emission and Removal that are produced every year, but by all the countries and submitted to UNFCCC. If you look at the Italian case studies, the few scientific work present in the literature show either a decrease or no changes, both in the Alps or in the southern part of Italy. However, the studies are very, very few, so it's not easy or possible to extrapolate data that describe the dynamics of soil organic carbon as a consequence of the woody encroachment. Usually, precipitation, it has been considered the main driver of the changes in soil carbon, with the carbon increasing when you have a high annual precipitation rate around 1,200 millimeter. Decreasing when you have high precipitation rate, while is increasing in dry areas where you have less than 1,000 millimeter of precipitation annually. So the objective of the study we performed were aimed to determine how the soil organic carbon was changing along a woody encroachment process taking place in a different part of the Italian territory. In particular, we wanted to investigate if there was an effect on the subsoil, so the portion of soil that is placed below 30 centimeters of depth. Besides, we wanted to investigate if the mean annual precipitation was the main driver or not along our Italian peninsula. But we didn't evaluate only the soil organic carbon stock, but we evaluated all the carbon pools along the woody encroachment process. So, all the pools, the ecosystem carbon stock as a sum of the above ground, below ground, the litter, the deadwood, and of course, the soil pool. Here you can have an idea of the location of the 7 sites we consider in this study. As you can see, they are placed from west to east on the Alpine Chain, and from north to south along the Apennine. What is changing basically is the vegetation types. On the Alp, we have basically conifer in the final stage of the cessation, while along the Apennine, we have instead basically broadleaves, oak species as a final stage of the cessation. Precipitation is, of course, decreasing from the Alpine Chain toward the southern part of Italy, and at the same time, the mean annual precipitation is a little bit increasing, even if we are in mountain areas. So the average altitude above the sea level was around 1,000 meters. So we are talking about mountain areas. This is just because one of the sites, it was discarded from this analysis because the stages were not fully comparable. However, I will describe you the results from the 6 sites. If you are in a forest, the pools that you need to measure are the 5 classic pools that are proposed by the IPCC, namely the above ground, the below ground, roots, the litter, what is lying on the soil, the deadwood, and the soil carbon. So, I will show you briefly, without going so much into details, how we measured the carbon in the pools of these sites affected by the wood encroachment process. For the soil, just to let you understand how big, even if it is not difficult, how big and time-consuming can be the work of determining the change in carbon in all the pools due to a process. It can be natural afforestation, but it could be also afforestation. To determine changes in the soil organic carbon stock, we applied a protocol proposed by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. So a protocol that was specifically designed to certify changes in soil organic carbon. Basically, here you can see there is a sketch of the scheme of the protocol we applied. In each of the area, we made 3 plots, and in each of these 3 plots, which dimension is varying according to the dimension of the area. However, in each of the plot, you spread a grid of 25 sampling points where you collect the soil samples at different depth down to the bedrock, or at least down to 100 centimeters of depth. In our case, we reached 70 centimeters because the bedrock was placed at that depth. However, you collect the soil samples at different depth, and then you make a composite sample by joining all the samples together. So in each area, basically, we get out 3 composite samples per depth and per site. Samples, of course, were brought to the laboratory. I will not explain you how they were prepared, but however, then it was determined the carbon concentration, and with the other parameters that we collected in the field, specifically the density of the soil, we determined the soil carbon. But in the same area, we measure also all the other pools, carbon pools. So this is a scheme of the plot that we use to measure the above ground, the dead wood, and the litter. Okay, litter, of course, it's something easy, like for the soil, you just collect the organic material that is comprised within a surface of a known area. So usually we use a frame that we know the area, and we collect all the material that then is took to the laboratory, dried, and measured for the carbon concentration. Trees are measured, all the trees with a diameter bigger than 2.5 centimeters are measured in a plot that is a circular plot of 13 meters of radius. You measure the height and the diameter of the trees, and then you derive the volume. From the volume, you pass to the carbon. The only pool that was not directly measured was the root carbon pool, because it's very time consuming. But however, there are many relationships, and they are called root to shoot ratio, that can be used to derive the amount of carbon in the below ground carbon pool based on the carbon that you have on the biomass. So we measure the biomass, and we derive the carbon in the below ground carbon pool using this ratio. The dead food, of course, was also measured, and was measured along this east to west and south to north transects, measuring all the woody residue that were lying on the soil. So by summing up the carbon in all the pools, we got the ecosystem carbon changes, switching from a mountain grassland to a forest due to the wood encroachment process. Let's see first the results about the soil organic carbon stock changes on the Alps, which involve sites colonized by conifer vegetation. As you can see, there is not a real trend. There is only, you can see that this stage, the T2 stage, show an increase of carbon in all the three areas. But then in the final stage of forest, the soil carbon is exactly the same of the one that you had in the initial stage, namely the pasture. And the trend was the same in all the three areas. What you can notice that is very interesting is that a big portion of the soil carbon, despite there were no changes from pasture to conifer, was placed in the subsoil, which contain slightly less than a half of the total carbon present in the soil system. A different behavior instead was noticed along the Alpine Chain, so from mountain pasture to forest of broadleaf, mainly of oak species. You can see how there is a small but gradual increase in the soil carbon, which is leading to a very significant increase in the soil carbon, which is stored in the last stage of the cessation. And the same was for the three sites we investigated. Also, in this case, it's interesting, very interesting to note that most of the carbon, almost half, is placed in the subsoil, the compartment that generally is not measured. Just look at the trend and some numbers. You can see how, apart from this intermediate stage where the carbon was, soil carbon was significantly higher than the initial stage, and this we related this increase to the fact that you start from herbaceous vegetation and you are at this stage where you have grasses, but you have also shrubs and you have also trees. So three different types of vegetation together in the same stage that probably are those responsible for the increase of carbon. But then you go toward a close forest where grasses disappear, shrubs disappear, and so the only input of carbon to the soil are only those from the above ground vegetation, litter deposition, and from the roots. On the Apennine, instead, the increase is very sharp and very huge, because if you look at the numbers, you can see that these are not significant. So it means that from pasture to forest, there is not any significant increase in soil carbon. We are talking about 2 tons of carbon more in the forest compared to the pasture, which is nothing. 7, considering also the subsoil. It's very small amount, and in fact, these numbers are not significant. Something completely different instead can
Danilo, can you hear me?
Yeah, I guess Tommaso has some connection issues.
Yeah, because I think we should ask also to the other participants.
Okay, he's back.
Huge.
Okay.
50 tons of carbon per hectare stored.
Danilo, maybe it's better to tell Tommaso that we have some problem.
Tommaso,
I have to.
No.
Yes, we missed the last, let's say, 2 sentences because I guess your connection has faded for a while.
Maybe Tommaso, switch off the camera. Maybe could help the video. Your maybe, but or maybe just go because. Okay. Thanks, Tommaso.
Okay, wait. Okay, this slide. I was just saying that in the Apennines, as you can observe, the increase in soil carbon is it's huge and significant. So that in the final stage of the cessation in broadleaf forest, you have 50 tons of carbon per hectare more than in the pasture. That if you consider also the subsoil, so down to 70 centimeters of depth, you reach something like 150 tons of carbon, which is stored in the forest, in the soil of the forest, compared to the soil of the grassland. And this is only the soil carbon. If you look at the entire and the changes involving the entire ecosystem, you can see that on the Alps, where we already observed that for the soil there were no significant changes, the changes are obviously due to the increase of the carbon in the other pools. And so at the end of the process, you have something like 200 tons of carbon per hectare stored in the forest, more than in the grassland. If you consider the Apennines, this amount is almost double, because you have a very big contribution from the soil, which is storing about 150 tons of carbon more in the forest than in the grassland. So you can easily understand that the vegetation is playing a major role during this process. Soil organic carbon, in fact, is varying a lot among sites, with the Alps storing much less carbon compared to the Apennines. I have to point out that this is a process that in any case is leading to a mitigation. But the mitigation potential of this process is strictly related to many factors: temperature, precipitation, among others. In our case, temperature was playing the major role compared to precipitation, but vegetation is playing probably the biggest role. Conifers toward broadleaf. So broadleaf can store much more. What is very interesting from my point of view is that the subsoil, it represents a very large pool, which usually is not investigated so much. But due to the changes in the root system, grasses have the roots mainly concentrated in the top 30 centimeters of soil. Forest trees have roots concentrated in the top 30 centimeters if you are talking about fine roots, but trees have also coarse roots that can reach something like 71 meter and even more of depth. So most of the carbon is reaching that portion of soil. So wood encroachment acts as a carbon sink if you consider the entire ecosystem. And it was very interesting, and I think it's something that needs further investigation, is the role of the intermediate stages, where in all the areas, basically, we saw an increase of the carbon, while the three different types of vegetation, herbaceous, shrubs, and trees, were coexisting at the same time. Okay, I think I wanted just to, because I think the time is going to finish, to show you the role. This is a short video. It's just a 2 minutes video that let you understand the importance of the litter layer for the carbon accumulation. Here you have the litter, what is occurring at the litter layer in time lapse within 1 year. This is a litter layer produced by broadleaf, which is easily decomposable because it is mainly done by cellulose. And in fact, you will see how it decomposes. Then, on the other hand, you need to take into account that evergreen forests, so conifers, instead the litter from those species doesn't decompose easily because of their lignin composition, and so they start to accumulate and forming very thick organic layer. Let me. So litter start to fall down from the trees during the fall. And so if you go, at least here in Italy, in autumn, in a forest, you will notice that the litter layer is very thick and the trees have no any leaves. But then if you are back in the same place in spring, you will notice that the litter layer in most of the cases is 0. So it means that everything, it has been decomposed during 3 seasons, basically: autumn, winter, and a portion of the fall. Part of this carbon is going back to the atmosphere, but a big portion of this carbon is incorporated into the soil. and most of the work of incorporation is performed by earthworms that just eat the soil and eat the vegetable, the residue, incorporating them already inside aggregates that protect the carbon and let the carbon stay in the soil for a very huge lapse of time, something like 100 until 1000 years. If you look at the residence time of the carbon in grassland and forest, we realized, we measured it actually, and we observed that the age of the carbon present in both grassland and in forest even more is in the order of 300 years already at 20 centimeters of depth. So you can easily understand that it means that, what is affected by human activity and by the vegetation is basically the top 5 centimeters of soil, while below the carbon can stay for a very, very long time, much more than the carbon stored in the vegetation, which is related to the life of a tree, which can be 100, 200 years, depending on the different type of forests. So, no any general rule can be derived for extrapolating the effect of the wood encroachment process in terms of mitigation potential. Of course, this is a process which is leading to mitigation, but the amount of carbon that can be removed from the atmosphere mostly depends from the contribution that the soil is providing to this process. Because if the soil is not providing any contribution, if it is not observed any change, you will have only the role played by the above ground biomass. But if the soil is contributing, such as the case that we observe along our Apennine sites, the mitigation potential provided by this process can be huge. So, thanks for your attention, and I'm available for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Tommaso, and especially for the short video. It was really, really interesting and explained very well what happened down there. Okay, there is a question from Gent. Which would be more beneficial for body inflammation increase, foods from a low pH soil or large pH in soil?
Sorry, the beginning, which is?
Which would be more beneficial for body inflammation increase, foods from a low pH soil or a large pH in soil?
For sure, food is, if you want to use your site for food production, it's better to have an high pH. Low pH is basically related to the forest vegetation. And so it's not so good if you want to have food production.
Okay, thanks. Any other question?
Yeah, maybe, if I may,
Yes, please. Could you please introduce yourself?
Glen, but it's pronounced Glen.
Ah, okay. Please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Professor. And I just wanted to clarify the question, if I may. I was more concerned in the sense that body inflammation increase, how to increase the immunity of the body. So the foods which come from a low pH soil are better for the immune system, or foods which come from a large pH soil. So it's rather as a consumer, not as a producer. Which one is better?
I mean, pH is just changing because it's switching the vegetation. So, and the switching pH is just related to the fact that you are changing the litter inputs to the soil. Okay, so you in both conifer and broadleaf, the material is arriving to the soil is made basically by a lignin with a small portion of cellulose, which is higher in broadleaf compared to conifers. Okay. In the herbaceous vegetation, so grassland, and even if you have a cropland, where you have a different type of crops, the residue are made by cellulose, and so you have a much more neutral, I would say, pH, which is much better if you want to grow some crops or to use those land for food production. While if you cut a forest and you want to start a cultivation, in most of the cases you need to add some compound to let the pH increase. Think to the case of tropical forest. When you cut a forest, a tropical forest, most of the nutrients are placed in the top 5 centimeters of soil. After a few years, all these compounds are depleted, and so you need to change a place.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? More questions? Okay, so I guess we can finish 5 minutes earlier as a gift for the weekend. And first of all, I would like to thank Lucia and Tommaso for this very, very interesting lecture today. And now I'm opening all the microphones in order to thanks properly. Just a reminder to the next week we'll start with the lesson in the morning. So we see you at 9 a.m. Rome time zone. Okay, microphones are open. So thank you very much, Tommaso. Thank you very much, Lucia.
Thank you.
And see you later in the next IPROMO session. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
This weekend.
Vai,